Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Medics Money MDT Podcast, where we get members of the Medics Money team and discuss current topics. Now, there's been a huge amount of speculation about Rachel Reeves' second budget that is coming up on the 26th of November as she scrambles to try and fill the £30 billion black hole in the public finances. So we thought we'd spend some time discussing what we've heard and what the Chancellor might potentially do in November. Now, of course, I'm going to say up front that speculation before a budget can always be risky, especially as we know that the government often float ideas through the media to test the market and test public reaction. So today is more for a discussion and not advice to do or not to do something before the budget. And with that caveat done, joining me today, we've got two key members of the Medics Money team. So first of all, we've got Andy. Do you want to introduce yourself, Andy?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Andy Pow. I'm a specialist medical accountant, been advising doctors for over 30 years now.
Beautiful. And we've also got Matthew as well.
I wish I'd gone first after that, but yeah, hi. My name's Matthew. I work very closely with Medics Money for the last 3-4 years now. And got a degree in economics. It's about my only claim to fame on record.
So that's a great claim to fame as a fellow economist degree holder. It's a great claim to fame. But I'm Ed. I'm a salaried GP on the South Coast, and I'm also a chartered accountant and a chartered tax advisor. And we're giving Tommy a bit of a break today, so it's just the three of us. Tommy is having a rest of his voice for now. Okay, so as we said at the start, speculation has been more rife than ever regarding this upcoming budget. Last year, we had what was known as a record tax rising budget to fix the public finances then, which the government were claiming were in a huge mess after the Conservative government. But now we're basically almost back to square one, and we're looking at another tax raising budget. So we're going to discuss some of the areas that we've been hearing about that could potentially impact doctors. And with so much in the papers, it's really hard to know where to start. Andy, where should we start? Should we start with maybe pensions first, perhaps?
Yeah, let's start with pensions, because it's always. I think every time we have a budget come round, pensions goes high on the agenda, and it's something that doctors particularly are very keen to know about and how it potentially affects them. To be fair, I haven't seen too much yet on that, but perhaps that's because some of the noise has been elsewhere. But certainly speculation seems to be wider than who's going to be here on Strictly and I'm a Celebrity this time round in terms of the budget. It's been going on for a while now. But I guess what could they do in terms of pensions? Well, we could see some return maybe to the lifetime allowance. So if you remember, we used to have something called the lifetime allowance, which got abolished by Jeremy Hunt. And basically what the lifetime allowance did is it capped the benefits you can grow in terms of your pension fund. That's been removed, but actually at the time when they did it, it was quite a surprise. And Labour instantly came out at the time and said, no, we're going to reverse it. But I think in their manifesto, they said they wouldn't touch it. But you could see that coming back, because that's just a way of actually capping tax relief ultimately on big pension pots, and doesn't particularly affect people at lower levels of earnings, because they're never going to grow that size of pension pot. Probably more of a worry, though, is the pensions annual allowance tax regime, and that's something that has really affected doctors and still does affect doctors going forward. Fewer than before, but we still have a sizable chunk of doctors that are going to struggle from annual allowance tax charges. At the moment, we've got an allowance of £60,000 of pension growth given a year. That does reduce if you start to earn above £200,000, so it does get tapered down. So not everyone gets that 60,000. But I have seen speculation again, and it's something some of the other political parties have said for time and time again: reduce the annual allowance, so maybe reduce it to 30,000, 40,000. And if that happens, we're going to just end up catching a load more doctors yet again in terms of the annual allowance pension tax regime. But as I said, I haven't seen too much speculation on it, so hopefully it's not an issue this time round, and it does need some careful thought. But it could be a possibility, because pensions, is a big cost for the government, and pension tax relief is huge. And the third point, which actually is debated every time we get a budget, is actually at the moment the way pension contributions work ignoring the annual allowance is that effectively you get tax relief on your pension contributions at your highest marginal tax rate. So if you're paying 40% tax on your highest level of income, you get 40% tax relief on your pension contributions, for example. So there's always speculation about reducing that down. And reducing it down, or even scrapping. I've seen in the past scrapping it altogether, and having a kind of ISA-style regime for pension saving. I'd imagine that wouldn't come in at the moment because that kind of change is massive in terms of the pension industry. So without really consulting on it, then I'd be really surprised if they go down that route, but it could be a surprising budget. So we'll find out in November if I'm completely wrong. But any of those three things changing could have some sizable impacts for doctors.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting when to go. I'm pretty sure one of the arguments for getting rid of the lifetime allowance was because of the impact it was having on doctors. I'm pretty sure Jeremy Hunt sort of mentioned that at the time. So we'll be interested to see if they do that. It was weird
because actually, certainly those of us that are quite close to the sort of pension tax regime, you've got two types of pensions. You've got your defined contribution schemes and your defined benefit schemes. Defined contribution being people like me who invest into a private pension. That is really suited to the annual allowance regime in that actually you get a maximum allowance per year. You know what your allowance is, and that's what you can put into a pension. So I can measure it, I can control it. Whereas the problem with doctors is the annual allowance isn't controllable because it's based on actually pension growth in their scheme because it's a defined benefit scheme. So any growth that happens that's different from inflation potentially can cause problems, particularly for those in the legacy side of the pension scheme. So, annual allowance isn't really suited to doctors. I think lifetime allowance is actually suited to doctors if they generally want to cap pension tax relief. What I would do is I bring in lifetime allowance for defined benefit schemes like the NHS with no annual allowance. It doesn't really matter how quickly you grow it, but once you reach that cap, that's restricted. And maybe flip it the other way for people that are investing in their pension scheme in stock market type investments. You get to get an annual allowance per year. That would work quite well. Jeremy Hunt, though, when he did it, I think he fudged it a little bit, partly towards perhaps some of his voting base that had high pension bots that they wanted to access. So, we shall see.
I refuse to hear of a politician fudging things and aiming policies towards their base. It's an outrageous claim. Now, there were quite a few, there's recently in the news as well, just kind of staying on pensions, moving a little bit away from the budget just slightly before we bring it around again. Not so long ago, they released the inflation rate for September, I believe, which will have an impact on doctors' pensions. Can you just expand a bit on that for me, Andy, before we talk to Matthew?
Yeah, so the CPI measure of inflation was 3.8% in September. And September is a really important point for public sector pension schemes because it sets how much your pension goes up. So if you're taking a pension at the moment, you're an NHS pensioner, it effectively means from next April, when the rise in your pension comes through inflation, 3.8% will get added on. So it sets that. So if inflation's come down by then to say 2%, I'm not sure it will do. Matthew will probably comment in a bit on inflation and where that's going. But if it came down, then actually you fixed in a 3.8% growth in your pension. But those who are building up their benefits, it's even slightly better because those benefits that are in the 2015 scheme, which is everyone's active membership scheme at the moment, is a career average earnings scheme, and GPs, their legacy 1995 and 2008 sections were as well. Your historic benefits that you built up in there also are linked to inflation. So they get uplifted by CPI plus 1.5%. So come April, all those pension pots are going to be uplifted by 5.3%. Which is a sizable uplift. It's it's a good return on in terms of growth. So it's a really important month for setting that. And again, that probably just chucks out a problem for the government because when we have high inflation, we've got all these inflation related benefits that go up, and they've got to fund them somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And staying on that inflation point, Matthew, and trying to bring it back around to how it may or may not affect the budget. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so when I saw that, my ears and eyes pricked up when I see an economics statistic like that released. So I think it was, from what I gather, quite a surprise to some that inflation held steady, given a lot of things going on in the world, and particularly, I guess, with the UK as well, conflicts, cost push inflation, businesses, national insurance hikes, all of this kind of context. It's not surprising that inflation is higher at the minute. Whilst it's surprising that 3.8% has stuck, it's not necessarily good news. For three reasons, the way I see it. Firstly, prices are still rising, so 3.8% being the same as last month does not mean that there's been no increase in prices. It just means that the rate in which they increase has stayed the same. So it's not necessarily a good thing for the sort of supermarket bill, if you like. Secondly, the UK's inflation target is 2%, as set by the Bank of England, and as you can clearly see, we're not quite there. And sort of thirdly, the reason this is a little bit worrying is kind of what this will mean for policy decision makers. So the MPC, who dictates the Bank of England base rate, which is currently 4%, they may see this sort of steadying of the rate of inflation, and they may choose to ultimately lower interest rates a little bit. That has good and bad things across the economy. Good for savers, good for borrowers even when the rate, and good for the government potentially if the rate goes down a little bit. Potentially good for mortgage holders. Not so good for savers. So it could, who knows what could happen there. I mean, it's always a balancing act trying to get inflation right. Hence why it sort of, goes all over the place. Secondly, as we'll come into, is that it may well result in tax rises. It's a tool the government has called fiscal policy, economics 101. Anyone who's done any elementary economics will know about it. But if they see inflation is going up, then the government will try and tax us more. However, as I was talking about this earlier with Ed, it depends which taxes they choose to affect. For instance, VAT is an inflationary tax, generally speaking, because that will almost certainly push consumer prices higher, ergo inflation higher as well. So it's a really difficult sort of swimming pool, if you like, of very finely tuned instruments the government can use, and it's not as simple as a 3.8%, static rate being good or bad. But yeah.
It's probably both, isn't it, really, in some ways, because I think the expectation was it was going to be 4%. So I think when it came out as 3.8%, even though that's high and we've got the highest inflation rate in the G7 at the moment, I think there was a bit of a sigh of relief that actually it wasn't quite as bad as everyone was expecting, even though it is still bad. And I've definitely read there's a thought that actually that may give the Bank of England and the MPC a bit of cover to potentially allow interest rates to fall, which would then have a knock-on effect on interest payments for the government, which then also may feed into giving Rachel Reeves a bit of extra headroom, because, as you say, she's got a bit of a hole in the public finances. So anything that will make it slightly easier for her, I think, would be welcome news, even though, as you say, 3.8% is almost double what the government's target is for our inflation rates. And interesting, I mean, you mentioned about, just as inside that chat there, Matthew, you mentioned about VAT. And of course, if the government were to increase VAT, a tax on sales or tax on purchasing goods, that of course would then have a knock-on effect on inflation. The Labour government, or the Labour Party, before they were elected and became the Labour government, did say in their manifesto that they weren't going to touch the big three taxes. So 2/3 of our revenue comes from income tax, national insurance, and VAT. And the Labour Party said in their manifesto, we have no interest, or we're not going to increase those taxes. You have our word for this. And that would include VAT, of course. What are we hearing about that at the moment? About those three taxes?
Well, sorry, Andy, go on.
Yeah, well, I just can't believe they're going to be able to keep to that manifesto pledge. The problem we've got is, if you're looking at, we almost feel like you're almost looking down the back of the sofa now, in terms of some of these proposals that are being touted as being changes. They are going to, they might raise £1-2 billion each proposal, but if we've got a 30-40 billion pound shortfall, that's not even touching the surface of it. So you're going to have a huge number of those tinkering around with bits and pieces to be able to get there. So to me, actually, they're going to have to do something that is uncomfortable. If we generally got this shortfall, and I can see we have got this shortfall, a lot of it's being interest led. The interest debt we're paying is huge as a country. So yeah, I can see that happening. Matthew, you got a view?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I was in my own world, and I was thinking VAT, if they choose that line of attack, is described as one of the more punitive taxes because it doesn't scale. It's 20% blanket, right? So those on, less privileged incomes or lower incomes get charged the same tax as those who, earn billions. And so that's not one of the taxes that's more fair because it doesn't scale, right? Am I right?
Yeah, it is, because it's a sales tax, and actually people on lower earnings tend to spend more of their money on actually purchasing things. They're not saving your stuff, so yeah, they pick up a bigger burden of it, and it will be inflationary. If actually, if we either change the VAT amount, so if it's currently 20%, if that went up, say 22%, or reduce. The other option is, which I have seen raised quite significantly on sort of the professional kind of budget rumour circuit, is actually reducing the threshold for registration. So the way VAT works is, if you've got income that's subject to VAT, or could be subject to VAT, because not all income is, and we'll perhaps touch on healthcare in a second, but if your cumulative annual income is more than 90,000, you have to register VAT. But actually, if you're below 90,000, then you don't have to register for VAT. And there is talk about reducing that threshold down to maybe as far as 30,000, which would effectively mean that actually a lot of businesses would then have to register for VAT, particularly small businesses. To be honest, though, that's not a lot different from actually a lot of the European countries, actually VAT registrations across the board. So we're a bit of an outlier here in that we don't force everyone to do it. The downside is it causes more administration for those small businesses. The upside is actually it reduces that kind of cliff edge threshold and takes it away, because actually it is a threshold. 90,000. I live up in the Lake District, and I had various friends who ran B&Bs, and actually the VAT threshold where it was a real problem for them. Actually, they had to close some of the year, because actually it wasn't worth them going over it, because they'd have to charge 20% on everything. So they kept under it. So actually it was stopping them working. So actually almost forcing everyone to do it takes away that problem. So I could see them possibly looking at that, but it is inflationary, because it's going to put, costs up in society. From a healthcare perspective, if that happens, healthcare in the main is exempt from VAT. It's one of those services which is defined as exempt. Not quite. Not all things doctors do is exempt, though. So a lot of GP practices, for example, are businesses. They don't have to register VAT, mainly because the bit they do that is subject to VAT is nowhere near 90,000, but it could be near 30,000. So it could, it could be a sizable change with sizable administration issues coming in. That said, there are some simple ways of dealing with that at the small end. There's some, flat rate schemes and ways of dealing with stuff which actually makes the admin quite easy. So, yeah, I think it could be a possibility. And you could then argue that actually we haven't changed any headline rates. We've just changed the threshold that you've got to register at.